Welcome to Storycomic Presents, where we interview amazing storytellers and artists. This is episode 230. I'm your host, Barney Smith of Storycomic.com, and we're excited to have with us the internationally acclaimed fantasy and historical fiction author, Willow Woods.
Hi.
Willow, how you doing?
I'm good. Cheers, you.
Good. But I really want to talk to you about these worlds that you created. So talk to us a bit about that. If you want to kind of first, for those that might not be familiar with Willow Woods, do you want to give people a little bit of background on how you got into writing fantasy and historical fiction?
Yeah. So I've always been a huge reader. I think ever since I learned how to read. Um, so I've got books everywhere. And when I was in secondary school, I discovered a fantasy writer called Tamara Pierce. And just to this day, many years later, she's still my favorite author. And I'm constantly rereading her books, and it just made me kind of want to be. It made me want to get into writing, so I started taking creative writing more seriously. I started both of these books while I was doing my GCSEs a long time ago. Um, so they've gone through heavy rewrites and redrafts. They've changed drastically over the years. So
Hmm.
where I belong, the first draft was literally, it was just like set in the palace. It didn't even go out into the world. It was the couple of years ago where I started really kind of uh creating the worlds and learning more about world building. Where I belong is set in the worlds, which with a stutter I can't even pronounce half of my stuff half the time. Um, so like the two kingdoms it's set in for where I belong is Carstairs and Sapphire. Um, and then the world itself is in my head I say Jadis, but I don't think that's how I'm meant to be pronouncing my own world. Um, but I stutter if I try and say it how I want to say it. Um, but I'm starting like an actual bigger world map for that, and I'm hopefully starting on my first trilogy, which will be set before Where I Belong, completely unrelated to it, just set in the same world in a brand new kingdom. The Shadow Courtesan is set in our world, but it's in like a hidden
Hmm.
location called Tenebrae, um, which I love Final Fantasy, but when 15 came out, I was devastated that was the name because I was like, I did mine first.
Oh no.
But I was like, because Tenebrae is Latin for darkness, so
Okay.
made sense for it to be called that. But yeah, I kind of love world building. I love how it's limitless with fantasy.
Hmm.
Um, I can go back and revisit, and I can add things in.
What did you start with when you're world building? Did you just kind of start off with a map? Did you start off with like races, religions, languages? How did you? What was the foundational to when you started building out Jadis?
I think for me, it was the characters and the plot line, and
Okay.
as they evolved, the world evolved. So Sapphire became more than just a palace; it became like a whole kingdom.
Hmm.
I explored the capital city a lot more. Yeah, the more I kind of explored it in my head, the more I tried to go into a map, and then I started designing like the little um house emblems and banners, which I described on paper first. So I like wrote down the descriptions, and then when I went to actually design them on the computer, I was like, yeah, next time I'm designing first, then describing, because I sort of realized taking it from what I'd written to putting it on paper was a lot harder to like actually make it work.
Did you? So as you talked, you kind of had these characters in mind, and now did you when you wrote down where I belong? Uh, how much did the characters kind of help evolve the world, or how much did you actually create the world in advance of having your characters explore?
I think the world, for where I belong, the world definitely came second.
Okay.
It was more it was more a plot driven story. Um, and it's now that I'm kind of, it was because I started it when I was doing my GCSEs. It's kind of as I developed in writing that I kind of
Hmm.
went in with the world building. So it's probably the last couple of years that the world really sort of came to life for me. Um, but I've got zero art skills, so for me it was all just It was all images in my head that just came out as words. It's only with lockdown that I really started experimenting with like doing maps designs and trying to get things out of my head and visually onto paper. But my art skills do not go that far. So
Give us a synopsis of Where I Belong. What can people expect from the book?
it feels really weird talking about my stuff, sorry. It's it's kind of like a contemporary fantasy. So it's a standalone.
Mhm.
That's one thing. I've not done a series yet or a trilogy. Both books are standalones. I think it's one of the reasons Where I Belong was a standalone is because as much as I love fantasy, I kind of realized it's not just a standalone book. You can't just read one. There's more in the series, obviously because it's a series. Um,
Mm.
Whereas there's sometimes where I just want to read one book. I don't want to have to get invested into like a whole 15-part series and waiting for like the next one to come out and then it never coming out. Um, so I just wanted standalone ones. So this one's contemporary fantasy and they're aimed at like the new adult market. So like in both books, the protagonists are kind of uh well, I think that yeah, not a thing. They're sort of both around their early 20s, so they're kind of past the young adult stage, but not quite in the adulting phase yet. I definitely wasn't in the adulting phase when I was in my early 20s. It starts off set in our world in Bournemouth. When I first wrote it, it was set in a town that was kind of similar to my hometown. Then it got set in Portsmouth, and then it finally moved to Bournemouth. And then it kind of moves on to the fictional realm. Most of it's then set in the Kingdom of Sapphire, in Evany, which is the capital city. And then I've done the world map, the kingdom map, but again, it's in Where I Belong. It's just focused in Evany. I don't really explore much of the other areas, but I'm sort of thinking about doing little novellas, little side stories, which I'll probably hopefully post on the website if I ever get around to them. Um, really good at procrastinating. Um, so it's all about sorcery and royalty. So Alexandra, the main protagonist, has amnesia because she fled from her own wedding when a spell kind of went a bit awry. So she ends up in our world through hypnosis. She kind of remembers who she is, but obviously no one's going to believe you when you say you're a princess from another world. So she's kind of a little bit stuck, kind of unsure of what to do, and then ends up back in her home world, tricked into not realizing that she's actually quite a powerful sorceress. Her husband doesn't want her knowing that. Um, he's quite a powerful sorcerer, but he's also a bit of, well, he's an evil tyrant. So it's kind of her working with a rebellion, but also kind of torn on who is actually the rightful king. Like, is the person who's leading the rebellion going to be any better than the current person?
Mm.
Um, a lot of conflicts. I think it does get quite dark. There's a lot of strong themes in there. It, it's got things. It's got abuse. It's got it's kind of drawn from history on how men treated women, how they saw wives, like especially in medieval times, wives were property.
Mm.
Um, it's got quite dark themes. My headspace when I was writing the final draft was not in the best of places. Like there are a lot of changes that I didn't actually see happening when I originally did it because the final draft got finished just after my nan died. Um, so I wasn't in the best of places, but I think it's made the story a lot more powerful. And then it's kind of got the historical links that I kind of didn't want to shy away from because it's how history was perceived. Like, it's not how history was perceived, it's how things were perceived then.
What were some of the things that were changed from your first draft to the final draft that you published? What were some of the things that naturally changed, or how many of those changes were active changes that you wanted to change
So when
in advance?
started writing it, I was about like 15, so it was not I think one person might have got killed off. A lot more died in the final version. I've never said who my favorite character is, so I can say this without revealing too many spoilers. But I ended up killing off my favorite character,
Mm.
which I kind of regret because I would love to go back and revisit their story, but actually I think it was better for that character. Um, there were people who, in the very first draft, she didn't communicate with like her parents again, like she just exchanged letters, but she didn't speak to her friends anymore. Whereas in the final draft, I brought someone from Carstairs back into Sapphire to kind of be with her, so she had like more family links and stronger ties with people. So yeah, there was a lot more character development from the first draft to the final draft.
How inspirational has was playing Dungeons and Dragons to the story?
I started playing Dungeons and Dragons after it was published, so I've only been playing
Oh
for
wow.
about 2 years now. So I started in lockdown. Um, but I think it's definitely given me more inspiration, more motivation for doing future novels. I think I might explore like the fantasy races a bit more in future ones. So in Where I Belong, they're all humans. I haven't really explored like the whole fantasy races. Um, I don't want to get too generic in doing the races, but I would like to explore and get a lot more creative, especially with like mythical creatures and things.
Mm. When it comes to the magic system, did the magic system that you created for Sapphire, is it as you say hard magic or soft magic? Like, is it very specific rules or is it more
I
flowy than that stuff?
I think it'd be a soft because it's down to like the individual person. So
Okay.
in Sapphire, Carlisle the King's really anti people who don't have magic. He really frowns like he would he would basically kill them all. I think I wrote in there that his grandfather did effectively. If you didn't have magic, he would kill you because he just didn't see why. Whereas Alexandra comes from a family that's like, no, you either have it or you don't. It's not something you can help. It's just how you're born.
Mm.
Um, so I think it's kind of it depends on the person. There's different types of magic. So there's characters in there who are seers. There's some who specialize in healing or fighting magic. Whereas with Alexandra, I didn't kind of really specialize her power. She was kind of a bit um, kind of jack of all trades but master of none. But she was also having to relearn how to use her magic because she'd been tricked into thinking she didn't have it. Um, so every so often she would kind of have a little spark and then found out actually no, I do have it and I'm quite powerful.
Was magic instrumental in telling the story, or was that just part of the background of the story?
I think it actually probably is quite an integral part of it just because of how Carlisle sees people. It
Right.
really kind of it says something about his character that he's yeah, it says something about his character and I think it kind of shows people who they are and how they think of people with magic. I probably could have taken the magic system out of it, but I never even thought about that to be honest. I just kind of
Mm.
had it in there and it just went with it. So it just became naturally part of the narrative. I never really thought about taking it out. But then equally I didn't go into too much I didn't think too much about going into like the specifics on the magic system just because it's a weird one. It isn't an integral part of the storyline. I mean, sorcery was a huge part of it, but yeah, I didn't go into to all that detail. But I probably didn't. I get if I get way down by specifics, I become obsessed with them, and I think I would then gone really too technical. Um, so I think it's trying to find the balance of explaining something but not boring people with it.
You have your second book that came out, The Shadow Courtesan, as you said, that is separate of Jadis. That's a completely
Yeah,
different world. As you say, that one is kind of adjacent to supposedly, takes place in our world.
yeah.
Um, now, do either these two books have sequels coming up? Because you do have a nice book, you have a nice works in progress section on your website.
Yes and no. So I'm thinking about doing a prequel to not a prequel. I'm hoping to revisit the world in Where I Belong, Jadis, but
Right.
it'll be set probably a couple of hundred years, at least 100 before Where I Belong.
Wow.
So it'll mention like the kingdoms, but it won't have any strong tie other than the world. So I'm hoping to go back and explore that world a bit more and develop on it. And I think that was one of the things that I've really enjoyed about world building, is that I have got the opportunity to go back there and do a whole brand new story for it.
Because Where I Belong, that's like it's an over 400 pages. It's a pretty big
Yeah.
book. So what would be your advice for those? Because you're also part of the Alliance of Independent Authors. How important was it for you to self-publish this?
So I did try and go down the traditional publishing route. I had what I nicknamed as my spreadsheet of doom, where I'd gone through and researched agents, kind of sent off God knows how many query letters, either didn't get a reply or got rejected. And then I started doing a creative writing MA through the Open University. And it was while I was doing that I realized, like, I always obviously knew writing's quite a subjective subject, but actually doing that made me realize just how subjective it was, because there's always that. I have massive imposter syndrome. Like when people say they really like my work, I'm just like, nah. um I find it really hard to be positive about my writing. It's really weird. In the first year, I don't think my tutor liked it. Could be I was really bad at what I was submitting, or it could be she just really didn't like the genre I wrote, because the first story I submitted was it was like a chapter I added in for the Shadow Courtesan, because at that time it hadn't been published. So I kind of added in like a new, I wrote a brand new scene for it, and the feedback was the characters had no development. She just felt no connection to him, and I was like, I've been working on these characters for, I know them like they're real people to me. They live in my head, but they're real people.
Mm.
And then the final one that I submitted to her that year was a short story that I wrote in like an hour or two. Like I just didn't, but I just wrote it and submitted it, and she came back saying it was like amazing. It was really strongly developed, and I was just like, "Are you kidding me? I did this in 2 hours." So I was just like, maybe I have like over like maybe the 15 years I have just been overthinking things, and they haven't developed, or there's 100 reasons. It could be she didn't like it, or it could be I was really bad. Like I am it was then that I kind of thought, well, why don't I just go down the indie route? And I looked into it a lot more. A friend of mine, she had been telling me for years to go indie. She was like, you can do it, just do it.
Right.
So yeah, finally just kind of took the plunge. I was also in a job that I wasn't enjoying. So yeah, I think I was in a meeting and I was just like, yeah, I quit. I'm gonna just focus on my writing. Um, and yeah, it's nice to have the control. Like I've got the final say on things, which probably
Mm.
isn't a great thing because I'm completely biased towards my work, so I do get feedback. Um, but yeah, I think 100% I do. I think going down the indie route is definitely the right decision. And everyone's been really supportive. It's great going to events, which I think if I'd gone the traditional route, I probably wouldn't have done. And I also kind of, when I was thinking more about doing the indie route, it was because I only write standalones. From a publisher's point of view, they're not marketable.
Mm.
I think when I've looked at like fantasy books or books in general that are getting published now, there's at least one or two, if not a trilogy, because
Right.
they can market that to get the demand going. And I was like, I don't want to write a trilogy just for the sake of money. I want to write because I'm enjoying it.
Could you use that as a marketing perspective to say, yes, it's not a trilogy, but these books are connected almost to the point where it represents from a marketing perspective, it has that trilogy feel to it if you're having them all take place in the same world.
I don't know if I would market it like. I've had people
Okay.
saying they'd like, so feedback I've had is they would like me to go back to Sapphire and explore like what happens after Where I Belong. But I'm kind of, I think for me at the moment that story feels pretty much done. I think
Right.
if I had a hit of inspiration, maybe I do kind of sometimes think about doing um, a little short story about Caleb and what he's because he disappears
Right.
halfway, well, three-quarters of the way through for a bit. So I sort of wonder about going back to cover what he was doing. But I think if I just did another story and just set it in the same world, I think I don't think I would market it as it's related to Where I Belong. I think I would just I think it's nice because when I'm at events, I'm talking to people, so I can kind of talk directly rather than having to rely on online advertising and just say, this one's a standalone, this one's a trilogy. They're set in the same world, but they're both completely
Right.
separate. So the one I'm working on now, in theory, procrastinating, because it's going to be set before Where I Belong, it'll just be name dropping kingdoms,
Mm,
which I think will be nice for when you read, if you then read that one and then read Where I Belong, you might be like, oh, name connection. Because I think when I'm reading a novel and they go back and they kind of name drop another place, I'm like, oh, I remember that place. Like, you get fond memories, but I don't think it would be necessarily to the plot line. I mean, in theory, I could just create a whole brand new world for this trilogy,
right.
but I think it would be nice just to go back to Jadis and revisit that one.
Right. And so I'd be curious too because you did. I mean, because you did go to Dragon Meet. Was there any push to say, "Hey, Willow, could you make this into a Dungeons and Dragons expansion or campaign, or could you do more of this? Could you make this into a game where we'd learn more about these different kingdoms and stuff?"
No, although I have sort of like, so while lockdown was happening, and I quickly dropped the idea. I did debate doing like a Dungeons and Dragons campaign with some of my friends set in that
Right.
world. I hate DMing. Um, I think it's really hard. I've done it a couple of times now, and I think as an author, what I put like, it's my ideas, it kind of flows how I want. Although there's that whole creative, like, the characters kind of argue back and you do have to change things. Um, but I've tried DMing a few times and it's just chaos. And it's a lot of improvisation, which I really hate. So I, yeah, quickly dropped that idea. Dragon Meet, I kind of went to, the first one I went to was in 2019, and it was an event I just found out randomly, and it was local to me. Um, so I went to it just to see what it was like, and it's always been great, which is why I keep going back to it. It's a great atmosphere. Um, I do have to try and rein myself in to like not go buying all the games that no one will play with me, because yeah, my husband's not really much into board games and stuff, whereas I love them. So it's kind of like, just stay at the table, don't go wandering off. Um, but it's really great meeting people who are into to Dungeons and Dragons. And it's also held in December, so a lot of people, even if they're not really into books themselves, they've got friends who are, so they end up doing a bit of Christmas shopping, which is nice.
Compare Where I Belong to The Shadow Courtesan. What's it, that book has vampires in it, right?
Yeah, they're so different.
Right.
So I was, yeah, it's kind of the cliche, but I kind of like enjoy vampire novels and fictions. I've always wanted to write like a vampire novel. So for me, I'll kind of read any genre. I think the only genre I really don't like is sci-fi, although there are books that I really enjoy that are sci-fi. So I'll kind of almost read anything. And that's what I found at events, is people are like, "Oh, this is what I prefer, but actually I'm going to try that one as well." Um because hopefully they'll enjoy both of them. Um but yeah, they're two very different books. Um Magic's hinted at in the Shadow Courtesan, just because it's set in our world, but in a place where it's eternally dark. So there obviously has to be magic at, or some kind of force at play there. But it doesn't become the whole focus of the narrative.
Do you see both of your books catering to the same reader, or are these two separate readers?
Probably, I think it's hard to define reader, to be honest. It depends on the
Hmm.
individual so for me personally, I would read both of them. I've got friends who would read one or the other. I've got friends who would read neither. Um, so I think it all depends on the individual. So I think if they're like, "Oh, I like the sound of this one, I'm not sure on it," I'm like, "Well, you could give it a go." Or
Mm,
I so if they're not sure on the Shadow Quarters, I'm like, "Do you like sort of dark fantasy, so vampires, not mythical, more like horror creatures. So like, are you interested in like werewolves and zombies? Even though those, they aren't in there, it's that kind of same genre almost.
mm.
Um, But if they're really like, no, I'm not into vampires, I'm like, oh, you might like the more magical. I think Where I Belong's more of a traditional fantasy compared to
Right.
Shadow Courtesan, even though in itself it's a contemporary fantasy because it's not fully set in the fictional realm, and it
Right.
doesn't have all the fantasy races and the magic system or creatures. Like it's quite human focused.
And so you also put on there that you do some historical fiction.
Yeah.
Now, because of your passion for historical fiction, what was the reasoning to make your fantasy tape be a contemporary fantasy and stay in that instead of like a like a historical setting in that sense?
So I think it does when it moves into Jadis, it does have like a historical fantasy
Right.
setting, and it does kind of relate to it does have like a quite medieval attitude towards people. I have started like a historical piece, but it's on the back burner, I think, because I've studied history. I'm getting too bogged down in the specifics. Um and I'm sort of almost it's really with fantasy I can be as creative as I want. I can kind of set the rules, create whatever. Whereas with historical fiction, you do have that kind of you can take liberties, but you do have to kind of be careful with them.
So, what would be your advice? So, say for instance that we have authors that might have written a book and that first time authors, and they're like, Willow, I want to do what you did. What do I do? I have a manuscript. I wrote this out. It's sitting on my computer. What do I do with it next?
So keep working on it until like you're happy with it. I was going to say 100% happy with it, but I feel like I had to stop once I've done my final draft. That's it. I basically never read it again because I will just keep rewriting it. Um Beta readers to kind of get feedback. Don't rely on friends and family because as much as you love them, the feedback will be like, yeah, it's great, or just not my cup of tea, which is fine. Like I'm happy. Like if people don't like my work, like really happy with that. Um, I like criticism, but it needs to be helpful. So being like, oh, I just couldn't get into it, didn't quite help. And I think family and friends are kind of reluctant to criticize because they're obviously worried about offending you. So if you get beta readers, they're obviously not going to be worried about offending you. I mean, hopefully they won't offend you, but they'll be more truthful. I got it content edited, so I sent it off to a professional. They read it. They kind of gave me feedback on like the plots, what they thought worked, what they thought didn't work. Um, on Where I Belong, they suggested a change to the ending, which I didn't agree with, so I didn't go with in the end. Which I could put my argument for here, but then that would massively spoil the ending. Um, so, I think it's okay to not agree with what people feed back to you as long as there's a reason other than just, well, this is what's in my head. Like for me, there was an actual reason for why that ending happened.
Mm.
Um, and then yeah, I think decide if you want to go indie or if you want to go for the traditional route. Or there's now hybrid, which I don't know too much about. Speak to other authors. Like Facebook's great for connecting to people, or well, just online in general now. There's like social media, Discord. There's so many ways to connect with authors. I think it's really nice to reach out. So when I was at Dragon Meet, I did a panel with LL McRae, who's a fantasy author. She writes about dragons. Um, so I'd signed up to Dragon Meet, and I was talking to him about doing a panel. So then I dropped her a message and was like, "Oh, hey, do you want to do this together?" So I think it's really great to kind of network with other authors as well. Because I think like someone once was like, "Oh, but you're all kind of competing with each other," and I was like, "Well, not really, because if you're at an event and you see people selling books, when we've been at events, we've been pointing each other out if someone comes to buy from us because we're like, oh, you might enjoy their work as well." Um, so yeah, it's nice to kind of reach out to other authors and connect. I love it when people drop me a message. Um, Although I always also feel really bad if my notification doesn't go off and I don't see the message for like a week or so. But yeah. um,
And so, what would be so editing is really important. At
yeah.
what point do you And so what it comes down to, as you said, from an independent author perspective, what about some of like the graphic designs of the covers or all that stuff? What would be your advice on how to have an author find how to format the book itself?
So for cover designs, I know some authors like to do, like, if they've got the skills, they like to do it themselves. I definitely do not have art skills, so I do. Uh, I've worked with the same guy to do the front covers for both books, author packages. Like, they're amazing. I sent a really vague description of what was in my head to them when I was first looking at getting the cover. Um, and he just, within like a couple of days, was like, "Oh, I couldn't stop thinking about it. This is what I've produced." And I was like, "Oh my god, you like cracked open my head," which is creepy, but yeah. I think graphic artists, illustrators, they're worth their weight in gold. Editors as well, don't skimp on it. So like, I made the tragic mistake of, for Where I Belong. So if you buy it online, it's fine, it's been edited. Um, the editor I used for the first print run, they didn't edit, and it was because I'd kind of gone for like a cost saving, and yeah, I made a massive mistake there. But I think that's the thing about being an indie, is you're on your own and it's all a learning curve.
Hmm,
Um, so that was a horrifying thing. And then when I went to getting the Shadow Courtesan done, so I will not edit myself. I will hire people to edit. Um, I know, again, people who'll edit themselves, but I'm sort of like, you need a fresh pair of eyes to do it. Um,
right.
so I'm not the best editor. When me and my husband, when we got married, we sent out our wedding invites and we proofread them 100 times. Still got the date wrong. Um, which is great on a wedding invite that you sent to all your family and friends, and you've put the wrong date down. So yeah, I definitely would recommend researching editors. I went through, I think it was like the Society of Editors, it might not actually be that name. Um, I went through quite a lot of people. I contacted a lot, and then they asked for samples. The people who were like, "Oh, it doesn't need that much editing," I was like, "Nope." Um, and then there's people who are like really honest, saying, it does need this work doing. So it's just kind of like working really closely with someone and taking that time to research and make sure that you're getting that quality.
Hmm.
Because you don't want to print a load of books with mistakes in them.
So Willow, so another piece of advice, say for instance that you have this author that says, you know what, I've been saving up my money. I got 400 pounds. What should I spend that money on?
I mean, that's gonna all go on editing straight. I mean,
Editing.
it's it's an expensive, so being indie, I've learned, is an expensive process, but there's also ways to kind of counter that almost. So I've not
Hmm,
done it yet, but I think definitely in the future I'll look at crowdfunding projects, which can massively help with costs. Um, Cover designs, it is unfortunately an expensive process. I think if you cut corners with graphics and editing, it's going to be noticeable. And I know people say you don't judge a book by its cover, but I feel like we all do. Um,
yeah,
like, the cover has to look nice, otherwise you're not even going to pick it up. Um,
right,
I get complimented a lot on the cover, and I have no problem being like, "Yeah, it's amazing," because I didn't do it. It's someone else's work. So I feel fine, like, praising the cover because it's completely someone else's work.
right. It's
So
like
yeah.
you're right. Like saying "Don't judge a book by its cover" is almost a request, not necessarily like a
Yeah.
It's like
I mean, it is a really hard, because we are all taught, like, don't judge a book by its cover, but yeah, it's a hard one. I mean,
yeah,
I have read books that don't have the most appealing covers, but again, it's all down to personal preference. What I think might not be an appealing cover to someone else might be an awesome one, and what I think is amazing to someone else be like, "Oh, that's a bit naff." Keep at it. You probably will get imposter syndrome, I think a lot of us do. Like, I've spoken to other authors who've all said the same thing, of they have imposter syndrome. It is kind of like playing Among Us and just being a bit sus. I still feel I feel really weird talking about my work and trying to praise it and sell it. I'm trying more to get it into libraries so that it's there for people who kind of just want to read it but don't want to buy it, kind of thing. So yeah, I'm also a massive supporter of libraries because I just love them.
And do you have, so if people are interested in learning more about your books, Willow, they could go to assierpublishing.co.uk. Did I say that right?
So Sherry Publishing, hopefully I'm saying that right. Sherrypublishing.co.uk. I've also now got willowwoods.co.uk, I think. Or you can look me up on social media. So I'm on Facebook, Twitter. Someone at Dragon Meat asked were my books on Goodread. No, they are. They're on Goodreads if you like to add things to your TBR.
And you're highly rated stuff too. I just want to point that out, Willow, that you consistently, if you even check out your the ratings on both your books are really high. So, and you've gotten some really good reviews. So
Yeah,
that's
and
really important.
it's really nice as well. Like when people like leave the time to review it as well, especially when it's not a friend's doing it.
Right.
Um, yeah, luckily not. I don't think many of my friends have actually done that, which is a good thing.
Right.
Um, it is really nice sort of when you. I do check it I do have a look every so often, not daily, just to see if I've got any new reviews and things. It is really nice when you find like a quite a high rating and someone's taken the time to review it. Um,
Right.
yeah.
Cool. Well, perfect. Well, thank you so much, Willow, for coming on. And listen, when you have your other books come out, make sure to come back on the show and we'll talk more about it.
Thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome.
Cool. So yeah. Um,
Oh, sorry. I got
no.
my I got so just so you know, we're getting a snowstorm
Oh no.
tomorrow. So I just got this auto, so I got my Fitbit and it started buzzing on me and I saw that I'm getting this missed call from the school
Oh
who's saying they're going to cancel school tomorrow. But I knew that was happening because I got a text message about it earlier. But
yeah.
so
Oh
I get to edit this part out too. Man, Will, I gotta be doing so much editing. This would be great.